The shift from output to presence in office culture happened because managers all of a sudden were managing knowledge workers that weren't doing the same exact task every single hour of every single day, but they still need something to do because like what are managers supposed to do if the whole point of a manager is to track and to manage work? And so I think the historical explanation for the rise of managing presence, which is, okay, well, I may not know what you're typing in that document, but I can see if you're sitting in your chair from 9 to 5 or attending meetings or responding to messages. And so presence became a reason for managers to exist.
Hey everyone, welcome to Leading from Afar, a show by remote leaders for remote leaders, where we dive into the most important topics facing leaders in the future of work. I'm your host, Scott Markovitz. I was the first hire at Envision, one of the first all-remote companies back in 2012. I've since helped build and scale multiple remote teams as an early employee or consultant. In each episode, we geek out doing deep dives on specific topics like within async, hiring the best talent anywhere, how to create a fun and engaging environment remotely, and so much more. This show was created to help managers leading remotely upskill themselves to help them build world-class remote cultures. If you enjoy this content, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, share it with friends and colleagues, and feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website. Hey, Adam, thank you so much for joining. How's everything going today?
It's going great. Thanks for having me, Scott.
Oh, I appreciate you joining. And from our conversation before we started hitting record, you noted that you're in Lisbon for running remote, which is quite exciting. We'd love to hear a little bit about that. But usually the way we start each episode is telling us a little bit more about yourself. Would love to hear a little bit more about the origin story of Almanac. And I think based on the topic we're going to speak today, maybe just kind of a brief history of your remote work experience, when it started, how it started, and all those good pieces, and we'll dive right in.
Sure. So, do you want me to just head into that story?
Yeah, go for it.
Cool. My name's Adam. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Almanac, which is a structured collaboration platform for remote teams. My background's in systems engineering, and before I got into tech, I worked at a lot of kind of complex organizations, starting in the Obama White House to the nonprofit sector to running strategy at Hawaiian Airlines. But for the past 10 years before Almanac, I was a product manager. It's like Apple, and Lyft, and and the reason I started Almanac is because I was spending a lot of my time at those companies doing work that didn't feel like work, wasn't work that was on my job description, certainly wasn't work I woke up in the morning to do. It was things like sitting in back-to-back meetings all day long, trying to stay on top of the never-ending deluge of notifications from Slack and email, all the while late at night after the chaos finally subsided, having to do my real job and into the late hours of the night or wee hours of the morning. And again, that just didn't seem like the work that I was hired to do or the work that I wanted to do. And I had this contrast with the engineers I worked with because I was a product manager who collaborated not in meetings and emails or Slack messages, but in GitHub, which is a structured collaboration platform for developing code. And the engineers I worked with were both way more productive than I was in terms of actual output, and also seemingly happier. And so I started thinking, like, what's going on with software development that makes them so much better at their jobs than we are, and also so much more satisfied? And how might we extrapolate some of those concepts over to knowledge work or the business functions? And so that was the origin of Almanac.
Yeah, it's a great story and great to hear. So when did you start? When did you go remote for the first time? Was it with Almanac, or were you able to work remotely with some of the previous companies as well?
Ironically, it was with Almanac. I even think we thought about ourselves at first as a remote organization. One of my initial co-founders was based in the United Kingdom, and so we were remote from the start because he didn't move to San Francisco where I live. And as we expanded the team, we like a lot of employers were faced with this choice of spending an exorbitant amount of money to hire maybe a mediocre person in my local home market of the Bay Area, or expanding our search to the world and finding uh, higher quality talent, often for cheaper prices, that were, even more excited to work at our fledgling startup than someone, say, who has been at Google or Facebook for their career. So it was a pretty obvious choice from the start that as we expanded the team, especially on the technical side, that we should be looking to find the best folks wherever they lived. It made business sense in many ways. And so we that's how we started and grew the team. I think before we even knew it was called remote or distributed. And we've stayed that way ever since.
Amazing. What year was this?
2019.
Okay, so I guess seemingly right before the pandemic got going, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's very interesting. That was okay. I think we have a little bit of a delay, but that is fine. Yeah, I mean
Is it
that's
my
in
fault?
essence
Sorry, I just
yeah, it's quite all
don't think
right.
I have anything else to open, but go for it.
No problem. So I mean that's seemingly the origin story of Envision. So I've been remote for 11 plus years. I was the first hire at Envision. I think we were probably the third or fourth all remote company back then. And I mean that was the idea of getting the best talent anywhere, right? And that was an issue faced up, I think, up to and including, right, or at least the beginning of the pandemic. It's if you were in whatever market you were and you were a startup, unless you were curing cancer or getting people to Mars, you couldn't compete against Facebook and Google and Apple because right you couldn't compete. I think nowadays, right, I think the tables have turned, especially on companies like that who are refusing to do remote work, which we'll get into. But a lot of these
Yeah.
companies, especially pre-pandemic, that I had met, many of them were coming out of Paris and Berlin, and they all kind of said the same thing. Hey, no, we're trying to build a startup from the ground up. We can't access the talent in Paris or Berlin. Again, they're all at these big companies, so we understand we have to be remote first to be able to hire the best talent anywhere. And it's a
Yep.
very kind of consistent story. And I think one of the themes we'll get into in our conversation today is that idea. And what I like to argue about is in the hybrid model, right? If you had any company starting today or right back to potentially to 2019, I'm assuming very much on the confidence side that almost 0% of those companies would say, hey, we want to build a hybrid company, right? We want to have
Yep.
some people in an office and some people over here and then doing like who would be stupid enough to do that? It's almost impossible to build a great office culture. It's even more difficult to build a remote culture and like hybrid culture, forget it. So who the hell would do that? But it's all these companies who are big and established now who are obviously, again, we'll get in a conversation, pivoted to remote work during the pandemic, are now kind of somewhat stepping back. And it's not because, hey, they believe this is the optimal model. This is kind of a middle ground. But I think we'll dive more into that topic. And so I think the foundation of this topic is, number maybe a month and a half ago or something, you reached out to me, and I thank you for that opportunity to be a collaborator on, I guess what I'm going to call it a manifesto for the future of work, the future of how work will look like and what work will be. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity. And what it did was kind of raise questions for me to think about, especially as we move forward and all the kind of ups and downs we've had of what I see, and I think we spoke about this before we started recording. It's I think 50% of us getting to the real future of work will be bits of like the manifesto that will be out by the time this episode comes out of it. This is exactly how to do the future of work. This is exactly how to do asynchronous communication. This is exactly how to hire globally. This is exactly how to do it. Playbooks that every company can kind of you pick up and run with and be able to successfully transition over. I think what a conversation I want to focus on today is the background of the history of work, how work has changed through the various evolutions, right? Kind of the future of work, I would say, is maybe like a version 4. What differences came with each change, good, bad, why they change, and how all those bits and pieces impact what the future of work will look like, whether it's good, whether it's bad, and what those pieces will, and really just have I think, a deep conversation, just, I think, thinking out loud, I think more than anything else, right? None of us are prophets. So none of us, in essence, really know what the future of work will look like. But I think we both have good senses of what we believe it should look like and why it should look like that way. So if that's cool, we'll go in that direction.
Sure. Let's do it.
Awesome. So, right, let's start back with the biggest, probably evolution to the way people worked in the Industrial Revolution. I think the Industrial Revolution will put the time frame from right mid 1800s up to I think and including World War II, and kind of digging into different pieces of how work changed and what that those changes look like and how that impacted what we've been seeing afterwards and what we're going to see in the future. So I think let's start off with right the need for a central place to work, i.e., an office or a factory. Right, everyone previously was an agrarian society, lived out in the fields, farmed. Industrial Revolution came along, and you built widgets or what you were building, and that required big, heavy machinery and whatever was in those factories. But you couldn't have those bits and pieces of those machinery all over the place. You had it in one central factory, right? So the idea of urbanization, right? People left the whatever fields, came to the cities because that's where the job was. All the work had to be done in the specific environment, in the specific factory. And now that was the first introduction of the centrality of getting work done, right? Which I think impacted post World War II, and now is kind of coming back of moving away from that with which what you said of the Internet of Work, and not needing an episode or not needing a requirement for a place like that. So just maybe wanted to dig into that of right. So you had horrible conditions, right? People left the field, they moved to these urban areas, terrible conditions, terrible living conditions, terrible working conditions. It was a bad experience, but that's what you needed to do. And we'll have a kind of just, again, we're thinking out loud here of how that change has impacted work post and what, again, the thoughts of moving away from that. And now, again, that we don't need a central factory, how that impacts how where we're going to be working from in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no economic historian, so I don't profess to be an expert on the history of work, but certainly the world that most people alive today have started work in is an office environment, which, yes, as you say, is um, a pretty close evolution to the way that we used to produce factory goods in World War II, and managers, even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, were managing white collar professionals as if they were parts on a factory line, which is to say that they managed work that only happened in real time, work that only happened in person, and the management style required a lot of control and minimal transparency. You only need to know the information to do your part of the process. There was someone, like literally above the factory floor, who is watching the whole thing, making sure it's working together, but you didn't need to, you had that broader context to do your job. And, it certainly works fine in a factory setting where every person or step in a process is only doing one thing. It doesn't really work as well for creative work or for knowledge work, where you do need more information and more collaboration cross-functionally. But at the same time, we didn't see people quitting their jobs en masse like we did in the last couple of years. And so I think while work wasn't perfect before, it was manageable and to some degree sustainable if you look at the data. And so what we see happening recently is it's not sustainable, it's not normal, but it is pretty new when you look at employee engagement and sustainability and retention data. The post-pandemic period of 2021, 2022 into 2023 shows like a bunch of indicators around work blinking red. And that's what's particularly fascinating to me, because as I mentioned, we do see now, mass levels of disengagement and burnout and quiet quitting and real quitting from work on the employee side, and on the management side, a ton of confusion and dissatisfaction as well. No one's there's a huge mismatch right now between the way that we're working now, which is where we're working, which is on the internet, and how we're working, which is as if we're all still back in that office from 9 to 5.
Yeah. And I think that concept of the factory and the office there was right. And that transferred into post World War II office work and moved towards white collar, as you mentioned, because the access to do your job, where the tools that you needed to do your job were essentially located, and you couldn't get around that. And I think obviously with the invention of the cloud, that has kind of moved away. I think we'll kind of dig into that as we get more towards that evolution. But so the idea of having a specific office, right now, people still talk about, oh, people are more productive and more collaborative in the office, right? I think both of us know that that's not true. I've probably at least 3 times more productive not in the office than I ever was ever in an office, right? But they're
Yep.
kind of stuck on that methodology of, right, the work had to be done in the office because historically it had to, again, really just more of a physical requirement versus a knowledge requirement. But now it's shifting away to that of, right, we just need a device and an internet connection, and the right, then we're not connecting to an intranet. We're not no needing computers or things that are in the office. We can now move away from that centrality of this is the location because this is the only place where you can do the work. Kind of
Yep.
transitioning to like the next point of what the industrial revolution kind of brought on was, and again, what we're seeing today is productivity based on output versus presence, right? Industrial revolution. I'm a huge geek when it comes to World War II, very fascinated by everything World War II. There was a great program, I think, on PBS, number maybe about 6 months ago, about Ford building some like 3 mile long factory in like nowhere, Michigan, to push out bomber planes. And it was just mind blowing to me that they were able to put out a entire bomber plane with some like 3 million parts once an hour. And like, that's just mind blowing. But at the end of the
Yeah.
day, right, up into World War II and including World War II, you were judged, your productivity was judged on how many cars you got off the line, how many bomber planes you got off the line, how many widgets you created. So, right, that's how you measured productivity, by an actual physical something that came out at the end of the day, at the end of the week, whenever that time there. And I think that is
Yep.
pushed kind of to me, I think has skipped most of the office work, and I think we'll dive into that. But it's still something very much present today of the idea of presence versus output. And even in a remote environment, like when the pandemic happened, all these companies were doing Zoom check-ins in the morning and Zoom check-ins in the evening, and Slack statuses, and like all these different things of seeing presence. And again, it made sense back then. Output will be very much of the future, but how that presence has kind of mixed in and still mixes in today, when right, realistically it really doesn't need to be there.
Yeah. Well, I think the shift from output to presence, in the in office culture happened because managers all of a sudden, we're managing knowledge workers that weren't doing the same exact uh, task every single hour of every single day, and so but they still need something to do because like what are managers supposed to do if the whole point of a manager is to track and to manage work. And so I think that was, I think, the historical explanation for the rise of managing presence, which is, okay, well, I may not know what you're typing in that document, but I can see if you're sitting in your chair from 9 to 5 or attending meetings or responding to messages. And so presence became a reason for managers to exist. Uh, and yes, I think that then detached what managers were tracking from actual output, because they weren't at all looking to see, is that work valuable? Is that work productive? Is it moving the needle for the team or for the company? And that led to, I think, that experience I talked about earlier of doing a lot of work that didn't really feel like work, just like pushing a ball through mud or paddling water underneath you. And I think a lot of people, there's obviously a lot of pop culture, TV shows and movies that empathize with that perspective of just the mindlessness of office culture.
Yeah, and I would even say that, I mean, that we'll go post World War II shift from output to presence was a necessity, right? Went from completely blue collar work to now white collar work. In an office, if you're an accountant, right, you were probably not putting out some financial statement on a day-to-day basis or an every week basis, right? You may
Mm-hmm.
take a whole quarter to put together a financial statement. The jobs where output wasn't a very strict and easily accessible understanding. So I definitely think that there was a necessity to move towards presence because, right, you couldn't really judge output when we shifted post World War II into the white collar work. And now I think even today, I believe that's part of an issue. And maybe would love to get your sense on this. That, and I've had this conversation with a couple of people on this show about how we see that even in the future. Right? I've been arguing with founders for the last God knows how long. Right? Developers at the end of the day push code to GitHub. As you kind of mentioned at the beginning of that show, right? And in the old days, like you push new designs to InVision. If you're a customer support person, you answered 20 tickets in Zendesk, right? If for an output, if I needed to see if you're actually productive, I just need to log into some cloud-based system and say, hey, did you answer tickets? Did you push code? Did you push new designs? Very clearly defined deliverables on a definable timeline, which makes sense as part of the future of work of, again, shifting back towards the original output. But there's still roles that are very kind of like the back office, ops, finance. I would even say product management on the sense that it's much more difficult to put a clear deliverable and a clear timeline. So I think that's part of the question of as we move in the future, like how do we do that when you have some jobs that are right super simple, code changes, design changes, support tickets, sales calls. But if you're like a people ops person, how do you validate what you've done, the output? Do you do it totally not an output or contribution? Is it maybe focused on the idea of impact, which again there is less of a timeline, but more if you just focus on did this new policy change have the impact desired or greater? And we don't look at timelines. So I think that for me, part of the challenge of getting companies over towards that output versus presence, it's even today, it's very difficult within some positions with remote and async and everything that some companies have today to really measure on a
Yeah,
easily kind of an easy way.
I'm not sure I agree with you that you know, engineering and design and even customer service are positions where you're just like pushing changes to code or to a design file. In my experience, even something like customer service or support, the work is varied every day. Some as an engineer, for example, some days you're building a new feature, some days you're fixing bugs, some days you're making enhancements, some days you're reviewing people's PRs mainly. So, and I think the same thing is true with a lot of with I guess all professions in knowledge work, where every day may be a little bit different. Even if the core responsibilities of your job, you might be able to bullet them out in a list of 5 to 10 things. I think uh, the work that you do is pretty dynamic, and so when we so I think your question is relevant for everybody. How do you measure output in a world where every day looks a little bit different? And for us at Almanac, we think a lot about this because we think about work as a game, and I think people are playing games in every part of their lives. And it's the question is always just what game are you playing? And in a world where the game of work is around presence, the game is how many meetings can you have on your calendar? How late do you stay in the office? How many emails do you answer a day? And if you think back to 2005, those are the kind of things people would brag about at a happy hour after work or dinner with their friends, like, oh my God, I was so busy today. And that's because that's the way that you win the old game of work when in the world of office culture. I think in the new world around internet work, um, the base level of output is a task. It's a to do on your to do list or on someone else's to do list. And I think what we've started to measure in Almanac is um, of the tasks that you put down, how many did you complete per week of tasks that other people asked you to do? How many did you complete? Because I think there's a base correlation between output and outcomes. Just because you're completing a lot of tasks doesn't necessarily mean you're doing great work, but I think the inverse is true. If you're not completing work that you said that you want to do this week or that other people have asked you to do, there's a pretty good chance that you're not producing good work at all because you're just not putting in the time. And the same thing applies to software development. There's a strong correlation between the number of pull requests, which are basically reviews that an engineer asks of another engineer to do, and the overall quality and their overall output and the quality of that output. And that's been proven out over time across many companies. And I think the same thing is true if we think about tasks as like the basic unit of collaboration for knowledge workers. And so I think that the first level of the game is, are you doing the work that you said you were going to do? Are you completing work that other people ask you to do? Um, and that's a good place to start with instrumenting. Are you producing? Are you good at your job? I think there's a second level, which is the work that you're producing high quality? So are you not just putting out a lot of work, but is that work actually moving the needle? And that's a more qualitative assessment. And the way that we look at that in Almanac, the way that we've instrumented the tool to help managers understand that is we have this a core workflow around reviews where you can ask for approvals on documents, ask for feedback, which is less binding, share a document with read receipts, and all those cases, the person you're asking for, say, approval has the option to either approve your document, send it back to you, or leave kind of a meta comment. So like red, yellow, green. And so we can actually look over time to see what percent of your documents did people approve, what percent of your documents did people send back. And I think you probably wouldn't want a world where every document was approved green. I mean, maybe that person is just really extraordinary. I think it's normal that sometimes you get work sent back, sometimes you get work approved. But in the same way, there's a strong negative correlation to people are always sending back your work, and being able to analyze that metadata on not just did you complete the task, but how did people think about your work? Did people think it was good? Did people think it was bad? That starts to provide some instrumentation around that next level of the game, where you're measuring not just outputs but outcomes. Did Scott push the ball forward with his step in the process? And what's exciting about this is we have analytics built into the tool that you can see on your own of how many, just on a weekly basis, how many things did you do? And we hear from a lot of customers that they get addicted to the scores, like that they want to see that every week that they're improving the number of tasks and reviews that they do. I certainly look at it all the time as kind of a measure of my own productivity, to see where I rank against myself. And we haven't even yet released showing people how they rank against other people in their company, which I think would make the game even more addictive. But I think that being able to clearly understand as a professional, like what are the rules of the game I'm playing, and how do I rank is core to the human psyche, and to feeling that we did great work at the end of a week, and ultimately I think that's what people want and need from their jobs.
Wow, there's so much here to unpack what you just said. I'm going to try to keep it very, very clean and moving forward. I think the first point that you made, as someone to retort to mine, I definitely agree on a day-to-day basis, right? Everyone does different things. But when I again try to think of for the big picture, I think it's a little bit easier a developer side or a support person, even if you look at like a week, right? If you look at developer, a sprint, right? And the designer, did they get the design handed over by the time of that sprint? Did they get the feature rolled out or the bug fix rolled out by the time it was expected? Did the person get an average of 20 tickets a day within the week versus other things? So, but I do love the point of your next point of every really moving like the idea of output towards tasks. So even let's say again the example that I brought, like a people ops person, right? They wanted to implement a new employee recognition tool, right? That was a new project that came on the line. So breaking down each step, right? 1 week of researching employee recognition tools. Second one, no, signing up and doing internal testing. Step 3, no, pilot testing. So in essence, right, you can still maybe on a week to week or on a shorter term period mark productivity by, yes, did they do the research? Check. Did they sign up for said tool? Check. Did they roll out the pilot tool? Versus, hey, it's going to be what's called a 3-month or 2-month project to roll out this new employee engagement tool, where I think the only way people really could have understood more like on the impact side was, right, doing pulse surveys. What does the employee engagement, employee recognition look like now? It's X. Okay, now that we've rolled out some tool during the process, what does it look like now? 3 months later, what does it look like then? And if there's an increase, okay, yes, right, that project was successful. You made the impact, fantastic, high five. But even bringing it down on the level of even just, right, everything is tasks, right? Again, doing this and then
And I
being
think,
able to combine those two. Go for it.
yeah, implicit in what you're saying is also an expectation of the time period you're measuring tasks on. And I think you're right that the faster, like the shorter cycle time or the shorter period that you're measuring task completion in, I think the more feedback that you get, both for yourself as the person doing the work and also for your manager who's looking at you. And I think one mistake people make, regardless of whether they're in an office or distributed, is getting feedback over too long a period. I think the ideal period to measure productivity is a week. So, what did you say you were going to do on Monday? On Friday, did you do it? If I have a project where I'm only looking to see did I do stuff over like a quarter or even worse, like a half a year or a year, I'm not getting feedback as the person doing the work on like how's my rate of progress. I'm probably also not then shipping work. And let's take your example of someone in HR or people ops. Like, if my job is to uh, write job descriptions, if I'm not getting feedback on them frequently, then I don't actually know if my work is good, and that's the outcome side. But I also probably I might be slow in terms of my output, and so I think a week is the right period to look at like task-based productivity. It's how we all, evaluate our kind of work in general. But one mistake, we have a core belief based on research we've done with the highest performing teams that the more you ask for feedback, um, the better your eventual work product will be. Said another way, there's a extremely strong correlation between the rate of feedback and iteration on a work product and its eventual end quality. So we like to say, the more you ask for feedback, the better the result will be. And so helping people measure their productivity in shorter time periods incentivizes people to ask for feedback quicker, get drafts out there, and then that just implicitly improves the end quality of the work versus having measuring work over longer periods of time, having it take longer, having the feedback cycle extend, and overall not really getting any input on like, is this on the right track? Is this good? Until, as you said, maybe months after you started a task.
Yeah, so I think that, I mean, perfectly lines me up for the next stage and what we'll talk about during Industrial Revolution. But I believe the future of work, step one will be output, right? All work will be based on output because that will be the simplest thing in most cases for people to measure. And I think beyond that, version two will be the impact, even in sales, right? If you're right, a CEO of Almanac, would you rather have a salesperson making one sale for $1 million or 10 sales for $500,000, right? Impact
Yeah.
becomes the end of the day and the ultimate goal. But when we look back, and again in the factories, right, when everything was based on simply output, in the factory days, there was no such thing as company culture and engagement and happiness, right? Your job, you came there at 9 o'clock in the morning, you did your job on the assembly line, putting together whatever. Maybe you had like an hour lunch break. There were no breaks. There was no happiness. There was no focus on literally anything of that. Just come in,
Yep.
check in, do your job, check out, move away. Like that shifted, which we'll get to in a moment in the office. But I think with your point of feedback, like that culture piece, to me, that's very much of a culture piece that like if you don't have that great culture of transparency and honest feedback and relationships within the team, does that lend to, hey, I'm not comfortable in giving someone honest feedback and kind of a yellow face or a red face because I don't want that person to be vengeful and then give me a yellow face and red face. So I'm going to just give green faces across the board. Everything was wonderful and happy. And so I think let's talk about that evolution of culture and engagement, where again there was nothing in the factory when you went to the office, where again it wasn't based on specific output and it was more in presence, right? That opened the door towards coffee breaks, which came into World War II, but relationships and smoke breaks and coffee breaks and all those things that were building culture there, because right at the end of the day, you knew that you weren't responsible for one plane or 50 widgets that day, right? You weren't responsible for some output, but now you could spend your time building relationships and having conversations and all those different pieces. And again, I would love to kind of hear your take of it and how it potentially looks in the future, because I know this is a very big point on like that async methodology, where I personally believe some people are going to go way too far with the idea of async, but just kind of love your sense of how it goes, where it's going, and where we're going with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think with COVID, and COVID was a one-way door into remote work, and with the pandemic, we lost, I think, the best part of the office, which is that, as I mentioned, even before remote work, there was meeting message overload in offices. There was chaos when it comes to basic collaboration, but at least you could turn to the person next to you and laugh about the dysfunction as friends, and get lunch with people and go out after work for some drinks. And I think the social aspect of the office, the ability to build relationships, was its biggest benefit. And what COVID did was that it exposed the naked truth about work itself, which is that it's a complete mess, while taking away the only thing that made it bearable, which is that you got to do with other people in person that you really liked. And so I think that's led to a crisis of connection and trust. And we can see that in the data. About half of remote managers feel like they have less visibility into the work that their team is doing. About the same number feel a lack of trust around the quality of work that their team is producing. And there's been a corresponding increase in micromanagement, where 40% of people say that they feel micromanaged at least once a week. 20% of people say they feel micromanaged once a day. And so we certainly, the role of relationships at work, in work, is incredibly important to people's happiness, and I would say their productivity. And I think it's a huge prerogative for remote managers and leaders to figure out, how do we create the kinds of relationships that people need to be happy and to do great work, even if they're not in the same place. And I think that's why you've seen the rise of retreats for remote and distributed teams. There's been an explosion, I think, of different models of how to do retreats, companies, of course. And so a whole mini economy has sprouted up around this. And I think it's like any new market, just, there's been an avalanche of experimentation around different ways that you can bring people together in person to replicate some of the best parts of the office. I also think there's been a ton of experimentation about how you can help people form relationships when they're not together, because it's just financially unfeasible to fly people around the world all the time. And so it's a big management opportunity to figure out, well, how do we replicate the kinds of deep relationships that people got in the office, even if they're online? One of the things that we've done at Almanac that's been very successful is a program called Almanac Community Dialogues, where we group cohorts of employees together. It's an opt-in voluntary program, and they spend 2 hours a week together for 10 weeks, talking about big life questions about relationships and work and purpose and meaning and family. And when they're there, it's a strict no technology environment except for Zoom. The time is protected so that they're not bothered by things happening at work. And the whole idea is for people to really get to know each other at a deeper level, not just at the, like, what would happen in a work happy hour after one drink, but maybe you go out, you spend all night with someone at work and you really get into it, or you have a really great lunch with somebody. What we're trying to do with the community dialogues is help people understand who they're working with at a deeper and human level. And not just have we heard amazing satisfaction scores from the program, but when we look at the retention data, I don't think we've lost a single. Well, in general, we have a very high retention. I think it's like 97%. But we haven't voluntarily lost a single person who's participated in a community dialogue, in our 4 years of running these programs. And so, and we hear from people all the time that because they know, for example, who Scott is at a deeper, more human level, they can collaborate a lot better. The work feels a lot more fun and satisfying. And, the community dialogues is just one of many ideas, I think, that are out there around how you can replicate some of the relationships that people have in the office online. And I'm not really worried about this, because if you look at the consumer side of the house, like, people clearly can create magic on the internet through, if you look at Reddit or Facebook or Instagram, like, there's all sorts of tools and apps and experiences that equal, if not exceed, the kind of magic you get from consumer social interaction in person. I just think we are 15 years behind consumer in figuring out how that should happen in a professional context. But I'm not worried we're going to get there.
That's interesting. And maybe I would love if you can give a few more examples of things that you do with team relationship and building, because I think when I think of the future of work and all the amazing opportunities it's going to open, the one fear that I have is in this specific area is the relationship building. Because again, we take historically output widgets. You didn't talk to anyone. You sat in front of your machine. You did whatever. End of the day, you went home with your family. That was it. As we push this async first messaging as kind of the way we're going to work in the future, which I absolutely agree with. Right? The whole concept comes on deep work, right? I can achieve so much more and what I need to do by deep work and not being bothered and like let me do my things. And it's even I had Chase Warrington on the podcast probably a couple months ago talking about IRLs, and we spoke about virtual relationship building, virtual engagement in the middle, and he talked about some of the things that they did. But it even seemed like even Duitch, what I think maybe like the creme of the crop of remote cultures and different things. Again, we didn't dive specifically deep into the topic, but it seemed like their virtual engagement was maybe like once or twice a month, um, and like what people do. So that I think to me that's my biggest fear is, especially many companies will probably get it wrong up front, right? Here, okay, we're doing async, we're doing deep work. Okay, now I'm going to be crazy priorities and getting things done faster. And when companies are kind of doing it wrong, and the employees themselves are also, hey, deep work, I can just focus on what I'm doing, does that relationship building, and yes, it's all voluntary, but now does it become like, hey, it's a distraction, right? I'm supposed to be working for all my day. I don't have any meetings. So now like you want me to have a coffee thing with somebody, you want me to do a conversation with somebody. Like this is taking me away from my deep work. So for me, I think that's what scares me the most, where people kind of get lost. And I think even like the last point I wanted to bring for like the industrial revolution, more World War II, was what we really got from World War II was the idea of mission-based work, purpose-based work, right? You were working in the factory to help win the war, to get your husband, father, son, whatever it is, home faster, right? Very big idea of mission-based work, somewhat carried along. And this is something that I argue with many founders. I've consulted with God knows how many founders. And even on this point of some founders have the idea of, and including that in a job description, their job application. That's one of my most unfavorite pieces. Like, oh, why do you want to join the company? In most cases, because people need a job, right? Unless you're doing something super sexy or super whatever. If you're building an accounting software, like, do people really care about accounting? Like, no, they just need a job. So, as again, potentially we move in this direction, do we move away from mission driven work, right? Maybe people are hiring asynchronously. They're not spending as much time building relationships. So it kind of moves away from the mission, right? It's just, hey, this is my job, right? I kind of come in 9 o'clock. I do whatever I got to do, deep work until 5 o'clock. I check out. I don't really care. I'm not connected to anyone else. I just come in, come out. That's my biggest fear. And you said like you're not as worried. But yeah, I'd love to, again, maybe some more thoughts on like the mission piece, and again, maybe a little bit more of what Almanac is doing to connect employees and build those relationships to hopefully prevent that. My greatest fear in the future of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that prospect that you just explained sounds thoroughly depressing, and I think we, and for that reason, I think it won't happen because that's not what humans need. I I do think that there's an overall trend around the internet of increasing loneliness and stratification, and it's not just about work. I think this is happening in all aspects of life. Um, we and I think it's correlated with um, a broader decline in institutions, whether it's religion or trust in government or trust in media. There's a recent startling poll from the Wall Street Journal that showed that Americans trust in a bunch of institutions, and it went through all the ones I just mentioned: religion, government, media, military has declined precipitously since 1980. The only institution or value that increased was money, um, which makes sense because it's pretty quantifiable. And I think that worries me a little bit to see that the things, these broader projects that give us meaning and purpose, where we're contributing to something beyond ourselves, that have broadly declined. There's been polls though that show that the only other area, the only other institution that hasn't declined is business. And these days corporate leaders, CEOs um, are are the highest valued and most trusted type of leader we have, more than faith leaders or government leaders. And we could discuss if we think that's right, but is the reality that and you can see it in the news every day with CEOs being asked to comment on questions of morality or questions in culture. And there's been a debate about how much companies, I think, should participate in that. But I think the reason that we're even having this debate in the first place is that companies and teams have become, for a lot of people, like the last one of the last places where community is possible, where contributing to something bigger than yourself is possible. And I think we can't lose that, and I think we won't lose that. So I think that, you can we can discuss whether it's whether every company should have a mission, but I think that, in the same way that producing bolts to build airplanes in World War II was meaningful, even if building a bolt itself was kind of boring work. Like building accounting software to help power other people's work, I think is a meaningful project. And I think it's not on, if it's the only person that it matters to is the person who's doing the work. And so it's not on me to say, someone may look at Almanac and say like, hey, I think that's stupid. Why would anyone build collaboration software? That doesn't seem like a good use of time. But what matters is that I think it's a good use of time, as does our team, and that we feel like we are doing something every day that's beyond just satisfying our basic needs, or satisfying our basic egos. And I think that's what makes work meaningful for people, is that you're contributing to something bigger than yourself, with other people you trust and respect. And I think that's essential to feeling like you've had a great week and a great life. I know on your point on deep work, I used to think that a great week was that you had time for focus and flow. And when we've talked to people, and we've interviewed over 5,000 people, we always ask, how do you define a great week? And the answer is rarely that they had time to do deep work. I'd say 85-90% of people I've talked to say that a great week is one where they got their stuff done, where they got stuff done. And that often means getting stuff done with other people. And so, whether that stuff is having a creative brainstorm, or whether it's getting through a list of tasks, or whether it's launching something and getting it out the door, people define great weeks by the work that they do, how productive they feel, and whether it was a smooth experience with the people that they were working with. And that was a surprise to me, but it makes a lot of sense. And so I think back to this question of like, are we going to end up in a world where people are just like, new widgets in a machine on the internet factory floor? I don't think so. Because I think people want more than that, from the thousands of people I've talked to, and they're going to jobs, looking for jobs that provide that kind of meaning and purpose, and the ability to feel like their time was well spent.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question, which is, I think, the last point in our World War II piece, and we'll shift now into the first internet age, we'll call it, in the 90s and 2000s. And I think it's very, 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 very focused today. Post World War II work, office, white collar work, both the company and the employee wanted there to be a 20, 30-year relationship, right? That kind of historic idea of somebody worked there for 20 something years, they retired at whatever, they got a golden watch when they retired. There was very much of, they wanted structure, they wanted long-term thing, they wanted dependency. We've seen that obviously shift today. I myself personally blame the whole VC world and investment model on that. I'm very kind of jaded in this specific area where, again, VCs are very focused, right? It's growth at all costs, right? Burn as much money so long as you get that hockey stick growth, and nothing else matters. And really, where people go from a founding team where it's a team, it's a family, it's a group, or whatever, the core people. And as soon as that money comes in the door, it just shifts. Now people are now numbers in Excel spreadsheet. So what we've seen, right, unfortunately, the last year is, right, company investor says, whoa, got to pull back the brakes, cut half of your expenses. And now a person who used to be a person, right, who's there for a long time, helped build the company, they're now a digit in Excel spreadsheet. And you do like a little lookup. If this number is higher than X, turn the row red and fire that person. So I think for me, VC world and money kind of forcing that shift from people and long-term relationships versus, hey, get growth at all costs and just come in, do your job. And if you can't, whatever it is, fire people at will. Unfortunately, again, which has been very evident the last year. Does that further entrench, maybe out of this I don't want to say a desire, because I definitely agree with you. Like, people want to go to work. They want to, I believe they want to have connection with the people that they work with. I'm very much of that sense. But if it's not a two-way street, and if the company again is just right, I have no choice. The VC tells me I need to cut expenses, and sorry, you got to go. With the idea of deep work and async, and again changing the methodologies, and maybe people just coming for project work and whatever. Again, what does that look like, right? Where it used to be, hey, I hire you at Almanac, right? I want you to be here your entire career, as long as the company is going. I don't ever want you to go where somewhere is, versus other companies like, hey, yours is here as long as the VC tells us we can pay you, in theory. And then again, what that does to the methodology and the mindset of the employee itself. Like, again, does it jade them that, hey, if the company's not really going to care about me and is not going to really go through tough times, and hey, you know what, if the CEO is not going to take a 30% pay cut just to save jobs, potentially save my job, why the hell am I going to go the extra mile or try to do something for them? So I'd love to kind of hear your sense of how we're moving in that sense of seemingly away from the long-term relationship from both sides into what we've been seeing in the last 20 years.
Yeah, well, I think in general, what we've seen with the internet, and again, we've seen this trend in lots of other places, is like the disintermediation of the relationship between on one side work, on the other side people. Before, if you wanted a job, you had to go work for an employer because that employer was the only uh, vehicle essentially that could gather enough resources to build a factory and buy the land and buy the parts to produce stuff. So if you wanted to produce value, you had to go to an employer, often at a physical location at a time. Um, and I think the best part about the internet, and we've seen this in music, we've seen this in TV, we've seen this in basically all industries. Now the person who creates value can have a much more direct relationship with the market. So Taylor Swift can start her own production company because she doesn't actually need a record company. She can distribute on her own. And in the same way, someone who produces work, whether it's obvious to see in the influencer or creator world, but it's true in every world, that consultants, they can go directly find work in the market without needing a company to back them up. And I think that's why we've seen, an explosion in different models of work and models of employment. You have like solopreneurs and creators on one end. You have, I think, employers using different forms of employment, like the contractor model has exploded versus just full-time employment. And people now can have more than one job, and I think it's kind of a rainbow of new options for people around how they want to work. And I generally think that's a good thing, because now people can work in the same way that remote has unlocked flexibility around when and where you work. I think there's new flexibility and options around how you work, how you get paid, and that can fit people's preferences and lifestyles. I used to work for Lyft, and what we heard from drivers all the time is that a lot of them just wanted to be their own boss, and we there would be working mothers or people who are caregivers, people who could never work in a company, who were driving for Lyft because it gave them ownership over their time, and that was a key reason that drivers joined the platform. And that's just one example, I think, of the diversity of new employment models that have sprouted up because of the internet, and because of what the internet can do between that relationship between someone who's creating value and somebody who needs it. Uh, in terms of the other part of your question, which is around maybe like someone's relationship with their employer, I believe that I roll my eyes when companies talk about their employees and teams as family, because I don't think that your team at work is your family. I think they're your colleagues. Maybe some of them can become your friends over time. Certainly, trust and respect is a critical ingredient to having a productive relationship with these people. But they're not your family, because inevitably the relationship ends, unless you're one of the lucky few people that spend their entire life at one company. Um, but I think, as we just talked about, in today's world, that's a very a vanishingly small group of people. And so I think one of the important things for employees to develop as a muscle in this world of internet work is having other forms of association besides the people you work with. Um, you know, becoming part of your local community, joining sports teams. There's been interesting data around things like CrossFit that I've seen in the pre-remote world. That the most popular classes were like 6 and 7 a.m. and 5 and 6 p.m. And now the middle of the day is the most popular time. Classes around 11 and 12 and 1 because people can now go work out whenever they want to. Same thing is true when looking at the like receipts from coffee shops and restaurants that people are now using their entire day to engage with their community outside of work, not just the periods before 9 and after 5. And so I think that's a positive part of remote work, is that people are rediscovering all the other associations they can be part of beyond just the people they work with, who, as I said, I don't think are in the end a group of people that might be there for the long term.
I love that point, and again, I appreciate you lining up my next question. So I think you're doing a great job of that today. And I think about the internet age. People started again moving outside of San Francisco to the suburbs, outside of New York to the suburbs, again transition to white collar work. So what we had seen, it's more of your life was in or around work, right? Before I went remote, I was living in Long Island at the time. I was commuting 70, 80 minutes each way down to downtown Manhattan. I worked, let's say, a 9-hour day. So 12 hours of my day was work related. And I think what that had caused was the big introduction of employee engagement, right? That employees going to have to spend so much time in the office, coming to work, leaving work, that we need to engage them and make them happy and do all these different things for them to kind of keep them connected. With that said, and I think as you kind of have pointed out, if we, again, as we move more towards remote work, right, where you can work anywhere, you don't have to come into an office, so that gets rid of the 70, 80-minute commute. We're moving more towards asynchronous. We're moving more towards the idea of output or impact versus presence. So I don't have to work a 9 to 5 schedule. I can live the life that I want to live. And that's a question I always raise. And when I think about it in the past, it fascinates me, right? If you think about when you're in office, can you ever remember at 10 o'clock in the morning or 3 in the afternoon going to the pharmacy, running an errand, going to the doctor? Like heaven forbid. Like that was what your lunch hour was for. Like you had a lunch hour, whatever errands and things you needed to do, that was the time. And the rest of the time was dedicated in the office and doing work. And yes, I think as we're moving towards the future of work, we're seeing that shift to allow better quality of life and people to do all those different bits and pieces. So how that impacts again our day, and I think the big piece, and this is I think one of the questions that maybe fascinates me most, and I would love to hear your 2 cents on it. Right, the company was always responsible and owned employee engagement, right? But what does that look like in the future? Now that people have more time, as you saying, they're doing CrossFit, they're doing coffee, they're doing things more in their local community. Where does the trade off come? Do companies say, hey, you know what? We'll support you being in your local community, right? We'll pay for a co-working space, we'll pay for coffee, whatever it is. We're not going to spend the time, effort in company and in employee engagement. We'll give that to you in your local community. Maybe take those experiences, real life experiences, and bring them into the virtual and try to build relationships that way, maybe outside of IRLs. But I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, because again, I see this transition as we future of work and as these things, the office and connectivity potentially within the company becomes somewhat less relevant, and maybe engagement more in the local community comes in more important. But how does obviously that translate into like the big emphasis of employee engagement equals productivity and happiness and all these different things that we've seen such an effort for the last 20 something years?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the first level is, as we talked about before, it's employee engagement is like a priority based on presence, right? It's like engage people in the office. And I think as we move to a world where outputs are important, the critical ingredient to an output based culture is that managers trust that that their employees are getting work done, even if they're not working from 9 to 5 in a specific location. And the way to breed trust is transparency. And so we need better tracking and metrics so that managers feel like they have some grip on whether their team is producing work. And I think that's totally reasonable, because I think as a manager myself, it's important to know that even if the game has changed and how it's played, that people are still succeeding at it, and that means that we're not measuring anymore if someone's in their seat at 9 a.m., but instead, as we talked about before, whether they're completing work that they said that they were going to do during the week, and that work is good and helping us create business value. And so, assuming that there's a system in place for managers to transparently understand if people are getting stuff done and that work is good, and that therefore there's trust between on teams. I think that then unlocks flexibility for the team around how it wants to build its culture. And I'm a big fan of markets, and as you can probably tell, experimentation. I don't think that there's one way to do culture, even in a remote context. I think one way to think about this is that companies before spend a certain amount of money on office rent and furniture and free coffee and social hours, and that the question is, okay, how much? What should we do with that money now that the context of work has shifted to distributed or remote settings? So some companies might decide, hey, we're not going to give any of that back to employees. That'll turn into profits in our P&L, and because employees own equity, or even if they don't, we're going to either give that value back to the shareholders. Some companies may say, hey, we're going to give that money as stipends back to employees and say, hey, you can spend it on a co-working space in your local community, or we're going to every day we'll let you subsidize or reimburse your lunch up to $20. Some companies may pour it all into remote retreats. Some companies may pour it into executive coaching or mental health services. And again, I don't think there's one right answer here. I think different companies will create online cultures in different ways, and I think employees will find a set of experiences and benefits and pay rates that match their preferences. And I think there will be more options because there's more ways to spend that money than before in an office setting, where there's almost a relatively constrained set of things that you can do in an office or in a city, like you were saying. And so I think there'll be a greater diversity of experiences that employees or workers can opt into that are better aligned with their individual preferences, leading to overall higher satisfaction. But I don't think there's not one right answer here, in my opinion. And as you can tell, I'm probably pretty optimistic about this, because I feel like work has improved for me since I've started working remotely. As someone who leads a company, I've been able to design Almanac in a way that fits my preferences, and I think find a group of people who share those preferences. And so overall, I think our employee satisfaction is really high, our employee retention is really high, our team productivity is really high, and I think that comes from the fact that, as a manager, as a leader, I have so many more variables I can play with in designing the way our company works. One thing I'll note, though, is that I still think there's going to be a distribution of quality when it comes to management and leadership. There's going to be some companies, like I think Almanac, that are really intentional about how they run the company, are aware about all these choices they can make, care about the quality of life and work for their team. There's going to be some companies on the other end that, despite having all these options, just are terrible at running their businesses and terrible at managing people and don't care. There's going to be a bunch of companies in the middle. And that's because I think if you think about the internet as a form of technology that has changed how work has happened, most technologies make people more productive. It's like, moving from a steam engine to an airplane. We can go places further and faster, but that doesn't. So our overall productivity increases, but it doesn't change the distribution of the curve. Some people take advantage of that technology more than others, and so I think that while remote work makes the world better on average for everybody, there's still going to be better and worse employers, better and worse employees who are able to leverage the technology of internet work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that as we move forward, especially around culture and engagement, it is that requirement for intentionality, as is the central word of remote work. And I think brings me to another thought that I had, that even now I'll kind of shift more towards the end of internet age one to the remote OGs, right? Historically in the offices, culture happened a lot in itself, right? You had lunches together and beers after work together and ping pong tables and all the other whatever stuff they were doing. Even many of the original OG remote companies, and I'll throw Envision in that group as well, weren't intentional
Yeah.
with the culture that was created, right? Because it wasn't easy. You just couldn't pop up and go to lunch with somebody. You couldn't go do beers after work, and again, required that intentionality. And I think that's probably the biggest issue. All these companies who are saying, "Oh, the office is we need the office for culture." Again, they haven't been intentional in redesigning these experiences. But I think per the conversation of where we said maybe more engagement in the local community and bringing those experiences back, I definitely believe that the future of engagement is what you said of interest based, right? Because historically, as a company, remote company, if we're doing things the right way, right, we're doing team events and fun things, but it's here, kind of take it or leave it, right? The entire team, we're doing a online Pictionary game on a whiteboard, right? If you like drawing, you like games, not like this is what we have. And again, I think that's probably the best of what we were able to do for many years in remote experience. But I think as we move forward, I think the connectivity and the culture piece will move much more towards, hey, right? Everyone doesn't need to be friends. Everyone doesn't need to be connected. Connect with those people who are into hiking and outdoors and whitewater rafting and talk about groups like that, or who maybe are local. They all live in San Francisco and they want to get together and work together for a short amount of time. Would love to kind of get your sense of like how that shift becomes much more into that interest based and what companies can do, and again what the intentionality will come into, right? Because how will a company create, I mean, will that move back more towards like the grassroots movement? Like, can a company say, "Oh, we're going to do a hiking trip for this group and like a San Francisco meetup for that group"? Like, will it even be possible? Or, hey, the power is in the hands of the employees. Like, you guys organize the way you want. We'll give you money to work to spend to do the things that you want to do. And again, what does that shift? Like the shift, like the ownership of culture still remain on like the HR people ops, or do we kind of go back someone to like the grassroots of, hey, you guys organize yourself, you do your things yourself, we'll support you financially. I think that's one of the things that also fascinates me very much.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there'll be kind of one way that this ends up happening. I think some companies, I think, will take the money that they were spending before on culture, which I would also include office rent in, and say, we're going to give this all back to you in the form of higher salaries. We will have nothing to do with culture, and it's your choice how you want to spend that money. You could spend your salary on a co-working space. You could spend your money, put it in savings, and I think there's a group of people that would absolutely love that and say, like, I never wanted my employer to be spending any money on this. I thought it was a waste of time and resources, and like, I want to work somewhere where my employer trusts me to spend money the way that I want. I think there are some people on the opposite end that say, like, my employer to I want work to be an experience, and I want to be constantly stimulated with programming. Assuming that a company can make money while doing that, I think some employers will choose that path, and have constant retreats and tons of interest groups that are centrally managed, and facilitated. And there's going to be some people that like absolutely love that model and want that. And I think um, so I don't know if there's going to be one answer when it comes to how culture is done, or even an answer to whether it's going to be centrally managed or distributed. Um, I tend to think that at early stage companies, a lot of the stuff is organic based on the people who are there, and that's why they best practices that pay really close attention to the first 5 to 10 or 20 people you hire, because they're going to set the culture for the rest of the company. Um, at our company, we have a Slack channel called Cute Feed that somebody created, and it's a hugely popular channel where people post pictures of their kids and dogs and funny stuff from the internet. I wouldn't have created a Slack channel called Cute Feed, but now it's an important part of our culture because by an accident of history, a random event, somebody did. Um, and so I think culture is often organic in that way, where what the CEO or the management team wants has some role, but also who you hire and their personalities and their interests often create a path dependency from the early days around what a company's culture ends up being. And that is totally out of the control of the founder or the management team in the first place.
Very interesting. So I know, cognizant of time, I want to keep it to two more questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
All right. So first one is, we saw kind of in the internet age the shift towards, right, global hiring, which then was focused very much on hubs, right? We hired a hub in India, we hired a hub in London, we hired a hub in whatever place it was, and salaries were always localized. So in London you paid X, in India you paid Y. So a lot of it was very focused on, let's find talent that we couldn't find before, and let's find it probably for cheaper. The remote shift towards remote work for most remote OG companies, for the same, hey, we want to get the best talent anywhere, was even still regional only. And this is still an issue today, which I get very frustrated with. Hey, we're hiring US only, or Central European time only. And historically, at least going back, I remember to the early days of Envision, when I was running the HR and ops for this, was, right, you had two reasons. Number one was legal compliance, right? It would cost a hell of a lot of money to create some subsidiary in some whatever country to hire one person, right? That issue is now solved by great companies like Deal and Oyster and Remote and others. And the other piece was on synchronous time. Like, you wanted that synchronous overlap, everyone to be on meetings and whatever jazz that you
Yep.
have now. As we shift, right, in the future of work, asynchronous by default, hire the best talent anywhere. Do companies, and what does that push the companies that we're going to truly hire anywhere, anywhere? Because we don't necessarily need, right? We don't have synchronous meetings. We have Oyster and Deal and companies that hire and pay people the way we need to. What do you see is that shift? And secondary, around salaries, right? That's always been a frustrating thing for me. I personally believe in the idea of global compensation, right? Somebody should get paid on the contribution or impact they make to the company, and not where the hell they live, right? If two people doing the same job make the same contribution to the company, why the hell are they being paid two different salaries? For me, culturally, that's a terrible thing. But I'd love to kind of hear your sense of where is there that shift to moving away from US only and Central European Europe, and hey, we're going to truly hire wherever the hell they are, right? Because we don't need to care about the legal compliance anymore. That's taken care of. We're moving towards async, so we don't need to care about synchronous meetings anymore. What does salary look like? And we'll go from there on the first question.
Yeah. Um, we've had periods at Almanac where we've had employees or team members in every inhabitable time zone that existed, and it was an interesting stress test for our operations. I think we sell software that helps people collaborate without meetings and certainly reduce their meetings. But I still think even in a company like ours, where there's 2 days a week that people work totally asynchronously, we still need meetings for a lot of things. And it can be a scheduling challenge, I think, to have people all over the place. It certainly takes work. Sometimes it's even impossible if you have, say, a team that has folks in Europe, the United States, and Asia. There's very few periods of time where someone isn't sleeping, and so I think that's maybe that's on the extreme end of can a company operate if it's in every time zone. You either have to be really asynchronous and never have to meet, or just get really good at scheduling and operations so that you can make it work. Um, so I understand companies that limit things a little bit to say we only want to be in Europe and the United States because that's manageable, or we want to be in Europe and Asia, or Asia and the United States. But I think trying to cover 24 hours of time with some level of meetings required can be really difficult. So uh, we that doesn't though mean that you only have to be in the United States. We see lots. We have a big team in South America, for example, and we see lots of benefits of having employees down there. We see lots of benefits of having a big team in Europe, which we do. We personally at Almanac have, I think, had trouble with, as I said, running a 24-hour operation that requires meetings. That's the honest truth. But I think it is possible if you plan enough and you really work hard to move async. I think on your question on comp, just to lay out the scale, on one side, one theory is, or one option is, we pay everybody the same amount no matter where they live. On the other side is we pay people according to localized pay scales. I'm not in the business of saying what a company should do. My personal opinion on this is, and the approach that we've taken at Almanac is to split the difference. So, for employees who are, if you think about kind of the top tier markets being San Francisco and New York and London, for comp rates, people in people in those markets need to be paid at those rates because the cost of living in those markets is high enough that their salaries are such. For people that live in less expensive markets, what we do at Almanac is we give their salary. We split the difference with the employee, and so between the price of living in, say, Denver versus San Francisco, we set their salary in a way that half of that difference goes to them in the form of higher salary, and half of that comes back to us. That we think that it's obviously more financially efficient for us as a business, but it also helps with employees who move to different places. If you move from San Francisco to Denver, it sucks as an employer to say, "Hey, we have to cut your salary," and it also gives people less of an incentive to leave a place that they might living for other reasons. It's where their family is. They enjoy the culture or the geography to a city like San Francisco just to get paid more. Because if you wanted to live in Jakarta and work at Almanac, splitting even if you're getting paid less in San Francisco, you're actually having a much higher quality of life because you're getting paid at some factor of the local pay scale. So again, that's the answer that works for us at Almanac, and that I think is a nice balance between the two options, because I see drawbacks to both of the extremes. But I really respect companies that have set a global pay scale, regardless of where people live. That makes a lot of logical sense to me. I also understand companies, often very large companies, that need to pay locally because it's just more easier to figure out and financially infeasible to do otherwise. So, I respect all of the reasons people pick and wherever they decide to be on the scale. But to me, kind of splitting the difference with the employee creates the right incentives for the employee and also good outcomes for the business.
No, here I appreciate the transparency. From my point of global comp, I put it more as, hey, I understand, right? I'm just simply not going to be able to hire people in San Francisco and New York, right? So I lose maybe that 5% or 10% of the globe, but I have the rest of the 95% of the globe. And hey, there's probably just as talented or more talented people in those places than there are in those specific cities. But the last question that I have, and because I know on time, I think the idea with asynchronous and all the things we're moving forward will get us away from this whole Monday through Friday 9 to 5 schedule, which historically has been the way. Again, much more on, hey, do a specific task by a certain time frame, and what you do between now and then, I could care less. Just get done what you need to get done. That makes sense again for that, so let's say, certain group of employees. But those, let's say, customer facing employees, like a customer support team, a sales team, that will be potentially much more difficult to do. So I think even in that, like, how does that potentially look? And even just culturally, right? You have 70% of your employees that are working whenever they want to work, and they don't have the schedule, and you have these other group of people who potentially may have to work a set 9 to 5 or what have you. Or will there be even the opportunity to more async even these type of roles, where support, it's okay, you don't need to be 9 to 5. People will hire people all over, and it's like a bounty system, right? You need to kind of jump in the queue and out of the queue and whatever, but you need to answer 20 tickets a day. Whenever those 20 tickets are, right? So long as they're coming in, do whatever you need to do.
Yeah.
So I wonder even how, like, within the company, will companies completely be able to go towards, right? Task, timeline, go for it, whatever is in the middle, totally relevant. Or will only be certain companies? And if it is, certain teams, if it is certain teams, like, again, is that any potential culture clash for companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'm excited to see companies that experiment on this front to see if there's a more variable model. One of the fascinating things about being an internet company is that you're serving people across the internet all over the world in different times and geographies. And so for things like customer service or sales, you actually need 24/7 coverage. because even it's Sunday in the United States is Monday in Australia, or customers have bugs or issues with your product on Friday night or on Saturday morning, and so you operationally need coverage across all hours of the day and week. And so 9 to 5, even if you had a shift, wouldn't be what many companies need these days. Certainly, at Almanac, we need on-call coverage for customer service and support all the time, and so we need people, or at least someone around the world needs to be at their computer in case our customers have issues. Anything less is below what people expect, and so I think already, in the fields you mentioned, we're moving away from the idea of just like a 9 to 5, and many businesses have created shift schedules that reflect an always on cadence. I think it's interesting to think, okay, well, can you move beyond just like 24/7 shift model to 24/7 24/7 queue? There's probably some operational mechanics to figure out there around like volume of when the volume of calls or work is actually getting done, and making sure you have coverage during those periods. So I'm not an operational expert, but it seems like you still may need certain people to be around at certain times. Otherwise, you might have too much demand in terms of it, like in customer service, inbound calls or tickets for the number of people you have to resolve. So your SLAs in that period go down because you don't have enough of your team online. So it feels like having some control over the amount of people who are online seems to me to be logically important. But it's an exciting thought to imagine a world where we can devise an operational scheme that doesn't require people to just be at their desks for a defined period of time, even in more operational roles. And when it comes to customer service and to sales, to our earlier point on establishing new rules of the game, those are roles that I think where a lot of managers are actually using output and outcomes data. So they are looking at, in many cases, the number of tickets you close and customer NPS on the support side to see, like, did this person actually do a good job versus like just were they in their seat for a given number of hours. And so I think it's good to see, and sales is another example of like, you can make one call, you can make 1,000 calls, but ultimately what matters is the amount of revenue that you bring in a given quarter and whether you meet your quota. So I think there's already a shift in many areas towards this more output and outcomes based model. Yeah, and I guess that the question is, can we continue to detach those outputs from presence? So I'm excited to see what some op teams come up with in
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. My previous role, I shifted my support and success teams to a 4-day work week, which was definitely interesting, and it worked out well. The support team, we had somewhat of a one person would work a full day on Friday, and then as a comp, they got off the following Monday, to ensure they still got a 3-day weekend, and right the next week they got a 3-day work week. I think Jason Lumpkin, I think, had a tweet maybe yesterday, the day before, which was quite interesting, of the idea of, on the sales side, right? If you walk into a store or you walk into a cafe, right, you get service, right? Hey, I need a coffee. I need to question about buying something. There's always a salesperson there. And I think the software side, we've moved towards scheduling and putting in the calendar and all that versus, hey, if somebody comes to your website and has a question, they want to buy something, like, shouldn't there always be somebody there to service that person? Which I think is fascinating how we move that. But people who are listening to this episode who are fascinated and want to get in touch with you, they want to learn more about Almanac, sign up for Almanac. What's the best way to get a hold of you, get a hold of Almanac? Obviously, once that manifesto is posted, that will be included in the show notes. So we'll definitely include that. But what's the best way that people get in touch with you, get in touch with Almanac?
Yeah, well, come check out us at almanac.io if you're interested in a better way to collaborate as a remote or distributed team. And you can find me on Twitter at Adam P. Nathan. And excited to hear from your community, Scott.
Amazing. Adam, thank you so much for joining. I greatly appreciate the conversation. I think it's, again, I think it's important for people to really understand, as we try to really push over the next hurdle, to really understand how work has evolved, how pieces were intertwined, what those pieces, how those pieces of the past will impact the future as we move forward. So appreciate all the great insights, all the great ideas that you've shared. And if everybody who's listening, until the next episode, have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for tuning into today's show. I really hope you enjoyed it. My aim is for everyone listening to have one takeaway from each episode they can then go and use with their teams. If you enjoyed the show, please feel free to support me by subscribing in your favorite podcasting app, on our YouTube channel, share it with friends and colleagues, and please feel free to buy me a coffee via the show's website.